to go ahead and get our next video started on 2.6. We actually have two essential questions here associated with migration. First one would be, why do people migrate? And the second one is going to be, who is migrating, which is a bit of an expansion upon our last discussion. I'm going to build upon some of that terminology. So let's start off with a basic discussion, a few more terms to ensure that we're all speaking the same language as it pertains to migration. First of all, we already said this, but just to clarify, migration is a permanent move away from a place. And in order for migration to be considered a migration, you must cross some sort of administrative border. In other words, we're really talking about country-to-country migration here. We can have internal migration, as we already discussed, interregional migration, intra-regional migration. But when we start to study the global trends of migration, we're going to consider the movement from one country to the next, so crossing those administrative borders of what defines one country to the next. Two other terms that I briefly mentioned in the last clip video, but I want to ensure that we have true discussion around. Immigration, with an I, is moving to a place. So it's easy to consider that. Just a quick way to remember, we say that immigration, someone's going in. Emigration, with an E, is when people are exiting a country or moving out of a place. Immigration coming in, emigration with an E, exiting. Two other terms here. Net in migration or net out migration. So when we discuss what causes migration, we need to be able to fluidly use the terms net in when a country has more immigrants, people coming in, than immigrants. You get a net positive number of migrants coming in. Net out migration, of course, would you have more immigrants than immigrants, more people leaving than coming. And you can see here, this map is actually out of date here with 2010 because it specifically does not have the massive crisis that's currently occurring in Syria with refugees emigrating with an E out of Syria to avoid the civil war and chaos that is there. But what we can see is we're going to use this map to launch into a discussion of general trends of where people are going to and where they are leaving. Okay, so some other terms to describe this. So when we're studying migration and what causes migration, we're looking at migration streams. We're looking what causes large-scale patterns of migration. Everyone has individual decisions. The choice to leave a given place is an individual's choice. However, we can still look at the large-scale patterns of migration that we're going to call, rather than just calling it migration patterns, we're specifically going to call those as migration streams. So the large number of people moving from Mexico to the United States, the large number of people moving from Eastern European countries, the countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, to Western Europe, these are going to be large-scale migration streams. Currently, the number of large-scale migrants moving out of emigrating from Syria and moving into Western Europe, into Turkey, into Northern Africa, these are all migration streams. Counter streams is an important term because when people move to a place, just like the law, Newton's law, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, every migration stream is also going to cause what's called a counter stream. So there's going to be some sort of movement against the stream. That could be caused by the native population, so perhaps a large-scale number of migrants coming into a place causes people to leave for whatever reason. Maybe they don't feel welcome. Maybe they're xenophobic and they don't appreciate people different than them. Maybe they feel like their place is changing. Maybe they're leaving because cost of living is increasing. There's greater job competition. So all of these, and actually the picture on the right depicts this when we give it to urbanization, that there's a large-scale movement in most developed countries for people to move into cities, to urbanize. But there's also inevitably going to be a counterstream, people who are either forced or choosing to move against the stream and moving out of that particular area. So as I mentioned, all these things, why does that happen? Could be overcrowding, could be people don't appreciate the cultural changes, could be racial or ethnic conflicts. But just use that Newton's law of every action has an opposite or equal reaction to help us understand migration streams and counter streams. So let's talk about why then, what causes net in and out, what causes migration streams. What causes migration are push and pull factors. Push factors, factors that cause people specifically to leave a place. Pull factors, the things that pull them in, that attract them to a particular area. Of course, everyone could say that every push factor could be considered a pull, right? I don't have a job, there is a job, right? So it's important to differentiate when I ask you to list specifically push and pull factors. Be sure that you're identifying separate ones. What is actually specifically causing them to leave, what is specifically attracting them, and that'll be important when we get to our FRQs. Anyway, push and pull factors, they can be related to the economy, to the environment, to government, to culture. So some samples here, and then I'm going to ask you actually to copy down the chart on the next page because it's actually a particularly effective summary. Perhaps there's a natural disaster that, of course, would push you out of a given place. The pull factor, maybe you can get a job in a particular area. Perhaps there's poor farming in a particular area. Maybe there's large-scale availability of farmland or better farming practices in a specific place. These are ones that I see as the best summary. You can see the relationship between the two. If someone's unemployed, they're going to be pushed out. Pull factors are the potential for employment. Lack of services or amenities, water, cable, electricity, they're not available in a particular place. Better services in an area. Maybe that can even apply to things like there aren't strong school systems. There's not a lot of entertainment options. These can all push people out and pull them into different regions. Crop failure can be a push failure, possibility of fertile land, poverty, potential for greater wealth, war, the potential for political security. All of these have the relationship between push and pull factors. The most common, however, just universally, whether it's through forced migration or voluntary migration, economic factors are the single most persuasive reason for people to leave, or most common reason, not persuasive, sorry. Most common reason why people leave. Most persuasive, of course, would be persecution if they're somehow facing a threat of their life. That would be the most motivating factor to leave. The most common reason people leave is just for economic opportunity, either perceived economic opportunity or actual real economic opportunity or place and opportunity given place. So those are the push and pull factors that explain why it is that people move. And we'll return to those when we discuss who's migrating. So now let's just shift gears. What causes people to leave? Any number of factors that cause you to leave a given place. Even on one more note I want to mention here that's not as prevalent here. There's also just simple choice, right? So if someone's retiring, perhaps they want to move environmentally. They want to move away from a cold place to a warm place. So the push factor would be the climate. The pull factor is a more attractive climate. That helps us understand the large-scale growth of people in the Sun Belt regions of the United States. A lot of retirees want to move to a more pleasant climate. So environmental factors that are just by choice and not necessarily all disasters are also important. Okay, so who's migrating? As opposed to why are they migrating? We have some terms that universally help us understand who's moving, and we call these migration selectivity, which are just essentially criteria for how likely someone is to migrate to a place. There are personal characteristics that help us understand that. People who are younger, ages 18 to 30, are most common to move because those people in ages 18 to 30, on the whole, have fewer attachments, so are less likely to be married, less likely to have children. By the age of 18, you're actually theoretically more actually able to pay for migration, your way to physically move around the world to a new place, you essentially just have greater ability to do so, greater opportunity, greater ability from ages 18 to 30. The single males are also the single most likely group that are on the whole, though that's changing. We see an increased changing dynamic of women and the changing role of women globally, particularly as providers for their family. We do see an increasing number of women engaging in migration, but the pattern still remains that males, single young males, are the most common group to migrate. Economically speaking, we're talking about, I'm sorry, this is blank right here. Let's add this in here. Economically speaking, that people with wealth, people with means, which means people with the ability to pay for it, are more likely to migrate than those who don't. If you don't have the ability to pay for those, there's tremendous stories that we'll look at with people who are invest their entire life savings simply into getting out of a particularly dangerous or difficult situation. So more likely the people who have the money to pay for it will migrate. Socially, I already mentioned this, but people who have fewer ties, if you're people who are single versus married, are more likely to migrate. They're just, again, general patterns of the ease of mobility. Someone who doesn't necessarily have obligations to others has greater mobility and the greater ability to migrate. So one effect of this, right, one of the things I just mentioned, so if people with means are more likely to migrate, often what that means is that the people who tend to migrate often tend to be some of the most educated people in a given place. So on the whole, it makes some sense that people from LDCs largely migrate to MDCs because the economic or perceived or real economic opportunities, better existence, physical safety, things like that. Often the people, again, if the people who are most likely to leave are often the most educated people, which is contrary to many what you often hear in the news modern day, then what that causes and then the one effect of those characteristics, that means that what that will cause is something called brain drain. And brain drain, just like you see that brain with his suitcases on the move, is that the more educated people are often leaving the places that need them most. So the most educated people from a less developed country are going to be more likely to get a documented visa or be welcomed into a most developed country than someone who's not educated. Now that makes sense. People want to gain, to bring in potential and resources and whatnot. But what that also means is that, as I just mentioned, the places that they are leaving the people that they need most, right? They need the most educated doctors and researchers and scientists and teachers and educators and everything else to lead that nation into greater development. So an example of that, and I'm sorry, this is cut off again. The average documented worker, and I prefer the terminology documented to legal, because that's someone who's fleeing a world sense of persecution. And the term the illegal immigrant truly doesn't do justice to who that individual is and the humanity of that person. So, an average documented immigrant is more educated than the average U.S. citizen. So the people who are granted citizenship often have far greater education, and we're talking graduate level study, than U.S. citizens themselves. So you can see this is sort of this comic in the bottom right is sort of a tongue-in-cheek analysis here. It says Buffalo brain drain. This is from it says another uplifting graduation ceremony. It's a reference to what often happens, and brain drain can be experienced on a local and regional scale. We're not just necessarily talking about globally. Places that don't necessarily have a lot of economic opportunity, then the most educated people often leave. This happens very frequently in rural areas here in the U.S. that the most successful people in a given place often leave for better opportunities. So brain drain is a big effect of the fact that we have these certain groups of people who are often migrating. Now, I just summarized those, but there's a term I'd like you to be familiar with. Ravensi's laws of migration. These were developed in one of the peak eras of U.S. history, of migration in U.S. history, which we'll talk about in the coming flip video. But these are called Ravensi's laws of migration. So I'm going to quickly read them. Every migration flow generates a return or counter migration. We already talked about that. The majority of migrants move a short distance. This makes sense if you consider the people you know in your own life or perhaps your own experience. People don't tend to, on average, the migrations that people undertake are shorter, right? They're interregional, intra-regional. These are not necessarily all large-scale international migrants. So when we study these global trends, these are people who are engaging in tremendous change. The average person does not engage in these international migrations. Migrants who move longer distances tend to choose big city destinations. Makes sense. If you're moving to a place, you're gonna go to a new place. You want to go to an area where there's likely to be more economic opportunity than others. Urban residents are less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas. Some of this comes down to means and the ability to pay for that, but we see that there's greater mobility from urban residents. And 5, families are less likely to make international moves than young adults. Already mentioned this. Families are complicated. It's much more challenging to engage in the risks of an international move with children than it is as an individual adult. This up here, this map, we're certainly going to return to this because this very much highlights some of the major migration patterns that we'll see globally, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into the reasons why. Okay, we want to return to this concept too. Now we need to touch on who's migrating and a forced migration. So we already gave our definition that people who are being forcibly moved from a location are known as refugees. And these refugees are forced to cross an international border. Now that terminology is important. To be considered a refugee, according to the United Nations definition, you must be crossing an international border. And now, just a review for those of you who have not yet taken some of the World II and throughout your social studies courses, if you're unfamiliar with the United Nations, that's our international peacekeeping organization. That's the organization whose job it is essentially to seek to better the world around us through diplomacy and to improve the lives of humans across the Earth's surface. This was a product of originally World War I and then World War II. So the United States has an international agreement. Anyone who's in part of the United Nations agrees to the law, or to the that's not the proper terminology. The provision, the regulations of the United Nations. These are not necessarily enforceable, but this is the point of a peacekeeping organization for people to follow this. So these refugees, the status of refugee matters because the UN, if you're a member of a UN country, by this UN agreement, this resolution, then refugees, if your country has refugees with coming to it, the UN says that those refugees are guaranteed certain rights. They're guaranteed rights to security and to food and to shelter. And it is the job of the receiving nation to help provide that for them. So unfortunately, what that often results in is many countries refusing to give people that refugee status. They're not acknowledging them as either fleeing persecution, or they're saying this is a voluntary move when perhaps it truly is forced. Some of this is political games. Some of it is the inability of a country to provide those basic needs if they themselves don't have the ability to provide for their own people. What this often results into another group of people, or the who is migrating. If someone doesn't cross an international border, then technically they do not receive that international refugee status, and so they instead are simply referred to as an internally displaced. Displaced would be to be forced out person. So they don't cross that administrative boundary into a new country. They're not given the UN status, but this certainly means that then leaves this complicated position where they're fleeing theoretically a place where they're not safe, they're not well cared for, and then they don't have without the refugee status, the only person responsible for taking care of them is the government, who in all likelihood is the cause of their problems. So we have these groups, and the flows of migration, or something, of refugees and internally displaced people. That's of tremendous significance in terms of how a country is functioning and how the people are being provided for. So something we're going to return to, and we'll look at that in the context of some specific examples. Here are those analysis questions. Just want to explain what I mean by question number 2. Select one of Robinstein's laws of migration and explain why this characteristic of migrants exists. I mean, return to these laws right here and explain to me why this is the case. Why do the majority of migrants move a single distance? Why are urban residents less migratory? So on and so forth. So select one of these and explain why it is the case for me. And there are the questions. I'll see you in class.